The AMR1. Never heard of it? Yeah, that's kind of the point. What if I told you Aston Martin once built a Group C prototype so spectacularly unsuccessful that it basically got banned for being too slow? Not too fast. Too slow. I mean, come on. When was the last time you heard of a race car getting outlawed for being underpowered? This is the story of how one of Britain's most prestigious marques created what might be the most embarrassing racing failure of the 1980s. Now, don't get me wrong, I've always had a soft spot for ambitious failures. There's something almost poetic about watching a company throw everything at a wall and having absolutely none of it stick. And the AMR1, well, it didn't just fail to stick, it actively repelled the wall. But here's where things get interesting. This wasn't some backyard operation. This was Aston Martin, backed by serious money, hiring serious people with a serious plan to take on Porsche at Le Mans. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out, absolutely everything. The year was 1989, Group C was at its absolute peak. Porsche's 962 was basically printing victories, Jaguar had just won Le Mans with the XJR9, and Mercedes was pouring Deutsche Marks into Sauber like it was going out of style. The regulations were simple enough, build whatever you wanted as long as it could do 11 laps at Le Mans on 51 liters of fuel. That's it. No engine restrictions, no weight limits worth worrying about, just pure efficiency-based racing. Sounds great, right? Well, Aston Martin thought so too. You're probably thinking they'd go with something sensible, maybe a turbo V8 or perhaps a naturally aspirated V12 like Jaguar. But no, this is where our story takes its first bizarre turn. Aston decided to build their own engine from scratch, not modify an existing one, not buy something proven, but engineer a completely new 6-liter V8 specifically for Group C. The official line was that they wanted something uniquely Aston Martin. The reality? Well, I suspect someone in Newport Pagnell had been hitting the brandy a bit too hard during the planning meetings. The engine itself was actually pretty clever on paper. Designed by Callaway Engineering, yes, the Corvette people, it featured 4 valves per cylinder, dual overhead cams, and produced somewhere around 600 horsepower. Rookie numbers, right? When your competition is pushing 700 plus from smaller, lighter engines, 600 horses from 6 liters is basically bringing a knife to a gunfight. But wait, it gets better. Or worse, depending on how you look at it. Max Bockstrom was brought in to design the chassis. Now, Bockstrom wasn't some amateur. He'd worked on Can-Am cars and had serious credentials. His approach was textbook Group C, aluminum monocoque, ground effects, the works. The car looked the part too. Long, low, purposeful. From a distance, you might even mistake it for something competitive. That distance needed to be considerable, though, because up close, the problems became immediately apparent. First issue, weight. The AMR1 tipped the scales at over 950 kilograms. For context, the Porsche 962 weighed about 880. That's 70 kilos of extra heft to haul around every single corner. You might be wondering how they managed to make it so heavy with an aluminum chassis. Honestly, that's probably beyond my expertise, but my best guess is they simply over-engineered everything. British engineering at its finest. Why use one piece of metal when 3 will do? The aerodynamics were, how should I put this, optimistic. Wind tunnel testing was apparently treated more as a suggestion than a requirement. The car generated decent downforce, sure, but the drag coefficient was about as favorable as a brick wall. During initial testing at Snetterton, drivers reported that the car felt like it was constantly fighting against itself. One test driver, Brian Redman, diplomatically described it as challenging. In racing driver speak, that's basically saying it was undrivable. But here's where the story gets properly tragic. Aston Martin wasn't doing this alone. They'd partnered with Nimrod Racing, who had experience running Aston-powered prototypes earlier in the decade. They had Mobil oil money, they had factory backing, they had everything except a competitive car. The development budget, north of £10 million. In 1989 money, let that sink in for a second, that's probably $30 million in today's currency, spent on a car that would struggle to qualify. Testing began in earnest in early 1989. The first proper shakedown at Donington Park revealed what everyone probably already knew but didn't want to admit. The car was slow. Not just slightly off the pace slow, but embarrassingly, what are we even doing here slow? Lap times were consistently 5 to 6 seconds off the Porsches. In racing terms, that's not a gap, it's a chasm. It's the difference between playing in the Champions League and struggling in Sunday League football. You're probably asking why they didn't just give up right there. Well, they'd already committed to the full World Sports Car Championship season. Contracts were signed, sponsors were expecting exposure, and perhaps most importantly, British pride was at stake. So they soldiered on, making incremental improvements that were about as effective as rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. The first race was at Suzuka. Actually, let me rephrase that. The first attempted race was at Suzuka. During qualifying, both cars struggled to even make the 110% time required to race. Think about that for a second. Group C had no maximum grid size, you just had to be within 10% of pole position time. The AMR1 barely scraped in, qualifying dead last and second to last. David Leslie, one of the drivers, later admitted he'd never worked so hard to go so slowly in his entire career. Race day arrived and, predictably, disaster struck almost immediately. Car number 18 retired after 12 laps with electrical failure. The second car made it to lap 39 before the gearbox decided it had suffered enough abuse and simply gave up. The Porsches, meanwhile, finished first through fourth. The performance gap was so massive that the AMR1s were basically racing in a different category altogether. The team regrouped for round 2 at Dijon. Surely things couldn't get worse. Oh, but they could. During practice, the engine in car 18 decided to liberate itself from the burden of containing its internal components, spreading expensive pieces of Callaway V8 across the French countryside. The remaining car qualified, you guessed it, dead last, nearly 7 seconds off pole. It retired after 23 laps when the suspension collapsed, probably out of sheer embarrassment. Now at this point, any sensible organization would have pulled the plug. But Aston Martin, bless them, pressed on. They made modifications, they brought in new engineers, they even considered completely redesigning the rear suspension. The problem was, you can't polish a turd, no matter how much British determination you throw at it. The fundamental concept was flawed from the beginning. Here's where things get properly farcical. By the time they reached the Nürburgring, word had gotten around the paddock that the AMR1 was basically a rolling chicane. Other teams were literally planning their strategies around lapping the Astons. Porsche engineers were overheard joking that they should thank Aston for providing mobile practice obstacles. The German automotive press, never known for their mercy, dubbed it der britische Witz, the British joke. Meanwhile, Aston's marketing department was in full damage control mode. Press releases talked about development progress and learning experiences. They emphasized the British engineering effort, the prestigious Aston Martin name, anything except the actual lap times. One particularly creative press officer tried to spin it as David versus Goliath, conveniently ignoring that David was supposed to occasionally land a hit. The Le Mans 24 Hours was approaching, and this was supposed to be the AMR1's moment of redemption. After all, Le Mans was about reliability as much as speed, right? Maybe, just maybe, if enough faster cars broke down, the Aston could tortoise its way to a respectable finish. The team spent weeks preparing, going over every component, double-checking every system. They even brought in additional engineers from ProDrive to help with setup. Qualifying at Le Mans was, well, exactly what you'd expect. Both cars made the grid, but only just. They were over 15 seconds per lap slower than the pole-sitting Sauber Mercedes. To put that in perspective, in the time it took an AMR1 to complete one lap, the Mercedes could almost complete 1.25 laps. The French fans, usually enthusiastic about any British effort at their premier race, could barely muster polite applause. The race itself, Car 18 made it exactly 4 hours before the engine, expired in a cloud of expensive smoke at the Mulsanne corner. Car 19 lasted until Sunday morning when the gearbox, apparently inspired by its teammate's engine, decided to scatter itself across the racing surface. Neither car was even classified as a finisher. The winning Sauber Mercedes had completed 389 laps. The longest-running AMR1 managed 127, but wait, there's more. The real killer blow came not from the car's performance, but from politics. See, while Aston was busy embarrassing itself on track, the FIA was busy rewriting the rulebook. Group C was dying, killed by manufacturer overspending and declining grids. The new regulations for 1991 would mandate 3.5-liter Formula One engines. Suddenly, the AMR1 6-liter boat anchor was not just uncompetitive, it was illegal. Aston Martin found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't continue with the current car, it was banned. They couldn't afford to develop a new 3.5-liter engine from scratch. And honestly, after the AMR1 debacle, Who would even trust them to build a competitive car? The program was officially canceled in September 1989, less than 6 months after its race debut. The official statement talked about changing regulations and strategic realignment. What it didn't mention was that Aston Martin had burned through millions of pounds to build a car so slow it made their road cars look like Formula One machines. The AMR1 had achieved something remarkable. It was too weak for Group C, a category where basically anything with 4 wheels and an engine could compete. What makes this even more tragic is the timing. Just as Aston was failing spectacularly with the AMR1, Jaguar was winning Le Mans with the XJR12. Jaguar, Aston's traditional British rival, had figured out Group C's, while Aston couldn't even figure out how to qualify in the top 30. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or more humiliating. The technical postmortem revealed just how comprehensively wrong everything had gone. The engine, while theoretically sound, was too heavy and too thirsty. The chassis was overweight and under-tested. The aerodynamics were so fundamentally flawed that no amount of winglets or modifications could fix them. It was like they'd tried to build a Group C car without actually looking at what made Group C cars fast. There's an interesting what-if here, though. What if Aston had simply bought a customer Porsche engine, or licensed the Jaguar V12? They could have focused on chassis development, maybe created something genuinely competitive. Instead, pride and a misguided desire for uniqueness led them to create one of racing's most expensive failures. Sometimes the best ideas are the ones that you don't pursue. The aftermath was brutal. Key personnel scattered to the winds. Callaway never built another racing engine for a major manufacturer. Nimrod Racing quietly folded. Aston Martin themselves wouldn't return to prototype racing for over a decade, and when they did, they made damn sure to use a proven engine package. The AMR1 had taught them a valuable lesson about the difference between ambition and capability. You know what the saddest part is? The AMR1 wasn't even memorably bad. Cars like the Life W12 or the Andrea Moda Formula One efforts were so spectacularly awful, they became legendary. The AMR1 was just mediocre enough to be forgotten. It's the sporting equivalent of finishing last in a race nobody remembers happened. Even among failed Group C projects, it barely registers as a footnote. Today, only 2 AMR1 chassis survive. One sits in a private collection, occasionally brought out for historic racing events where it continues to circulate at the back of the field, like some sort of automotive ghost condemned to eternal slowness. The other is in Aston Martin's own museum, presumably as a reminder of what happens when ambition writes checks that engineering can't cash. The financial impact was severe enough that it contributed to Aston Martin's eventual bankruptcy in 1990. Ford would swoop in to save the company, but the AMR1 project had drained resources that could have gone toward developing competitive road cars. In trying to enhance their sporting image, they'd nearly destroyed the entire company. Talk about an own goal. What's particularly galling is that the AMR1 wasn't even a noble failure. Cars like the Nissan Delta Wing or the Mazda 787B tried something genuinely innovative. The AMR1 tried nothing new, it just did everything worse than everyone else. It was conservatively designed, conventionally engineered, and conventionally slow. The only unconventional thing about it was how badly it failed. Modern Aston Martin racing efforts have been notably more successful, partially because they learned from the AMR1 disaster. They now partner with established racing firms, use proven engines, and actually test their cars before showing up to races. Revolutionary concepts, I know. The current Aston Martin Formula One team may be struggling, but at least they can qualify within 107% of pole position. There's a certain tragedy in the AMR1 story that goes beyond mere failure. This was Aston Martin's attempt to play with the big boys, to prove they belonged at the highest level of motorsport. Instead, they proved the opposite so comprehensively that they basically got banned by default. When the regulations changed to exclude their engine, nobody fought for an exemption because nobody thought the AMR1 deserved one. The irony is that Group C was actually the perfect category for a project like this. The fuel economy formula meant that even an underpowered car could theoretically compete through efficiency. The problem was, the AMR1 wasn't even efficient. It was thirsty, slow, and unreliable. The motorsport equivalent of a triple threat, except all the threats were to your own finishing position. I sometimes wonder what the Aston Martin engineers felt, watching from the pit wall as their cars circulated. 15 seconds off the pace. Did they still believe improvements were possible? Or did they know, deep down, that they'd created a £6 million embarrassment? The test drivers certainly knew. Brian Redman later described driving the AMR1 as character building, which is the politest way possible to say absolutely miserable. The AMR1's legacy, such as it is, serves as a cautionary tale about corporate hubris. Aston Martin looked at Porsche's dominance, Jaguar's success, and thought, how hard could it be? The answer, as 1989 brutally demonstrated, was harder than you could possibly imagine. They'd confused having money with having capability, a mistake that racing has punished since the very first motorized competition. Perhaps the ultimate insult came years later when historic racing categories had to create special rules to make the AMR1 competitive. They literally gave it performance brakes, additional fuel capacity, anything to prevent it from being lapped multiple times in short races. Even with these advantages, AMR1s still usually finish at the back. Some cars are born slow, and no amount of regulatory assistance can fix that. You have to admire the current owners who still race these things, though. There's something beautifully quixotic about taking a car that was uncompetitive when new and continuing to race it decades later. Maybe they appreciate the irony, or maybe they just enjoy the challenge of trying to make a fundamentally flawed machine go quickly. Either way, they're keeping the memory of Aston's greatest racing failure alive. The technical specifications, when you really look at them, weren't that bad on paper. 6 liters, 600 horsepower, aluminum construction, ground effects. In 1975, this would have been a world beater. In 1989, it was a joke. Racing development moved so fast that being 5 years behind might as well be 50. The AMR1 wasn't just fighting Porsche and Jaguar, it was fighting the march of progress itself and losing badly. What really killed the AMR1 wasn't the regulation change, though. It was already dead. The new rules just provided a convenient excuse to bury it. Can you imagine if Group C had continued unchanged? How many more races would Aston have entered, throwing good money after bad, hoping that somehow, someway, the car would magically become competitive? The regulation change was almost merciful in its finality. The whole episode damaged Aston Martin's motorsport reputation so badly that when they returned to Le Mans in 2005 with the DBR9, people were genuinely surprised when it was actually competitive. The ghost of the AMR1 hung over that project, a reminder of what happens when ambition exceeds ability. That the DBR9 actually won its class was probably more surprising to Aston Martin than anyone else. Sometimes I wonder if anyone at modern Aston Martin remembers the AMR1. It's not exactly something you'd bring up at company meetings. Remember that time we built a race car so bad, it got banned for being too slow. Yet forgetting it would be a mistake. The AMR1 is a perfect example of how even established manufacturers can get it completely, catastrophically wrong. The story usually goes that race cars get banned for being too fast, too innovative, or too dangerous. The Chaparral 2JD with its fans, the Brabham BT46B, the Toyota GT1's loophole exploitation. The AMR1 might be the only car in history that got banned for being too pathetic when regulations specifically exclude your engine formula and nobody protests because your car is so slow it doesn't matter anyway. You know you've achieved a special kind of failure. In the end, the AMR1's greatest achievement might be serving as a warning to others. When Red Bull was considering entering Formula One, they studied failed manufacturer entries, and the AMR1 was repeatedly cited as what not to do. Don't build your own engine unless you really know what you're doing. Don't undertest. Don't assume that road car success translates to race car competence. Basic lessons, but ones that Aston Martin learned the hardest way possible. The final twist in this whole sad saga. In 2011, Aston Martin returned to prototype racing with the AMR1. Different era, different regulations, but somehow, amazingly, they managed to create another failure. The car retired from Le Mans after just 4 laps with engine problems. 22 years later, and they'd learned absolutely nothing. Maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that the AMR1 failed, but that its lessons went completely unheeded. History has a sense of humor sometimes. The AMR1 was so unsuccessful that it actually succeeded in one way. It definitively proved that Aston Martin had no business building prototype race cars from scratch. That's an achievement of sorts, even if it's not one you'd put in the company museum. Although wait, they actually did put one in their museum. I suppose even failures deserve to be remembered. especially failures this spectacular. The shocking truth about why the AMR1 was banned. It wasn't really banned at all. It was just so hopelessly uncompetitive that when regulations changed to exclude it, nobody cared enough to argue. That's perhaps the most damning indictment of all. Not that it was deliberately targeted, but that it was completely irrelevant. The car that was too weak for Group C rules didn't die a dramatic death. It simply faded away, unmourned and unmarked. And yet, there's something almost noble about the attempt. Aston Martin tried to compete at the highest level of sports car racing. They failed catastrophically, yes, but they tried. In an era where manufacturers play it safe, there's something to be said for a company that was willing to risk everything on an impossible dream, even if that dream turned into a nightmare that cost millions and contributed to a bankruptcy. The AMR1 remains a curious footnote in racing history, too unsuccessful to be famous, too expensive to be forgotten, too British to admit complete defeat. It exists in that strange limbo of racing failures, not quite bad enough to be legendary, not quite good enough to be remembered fondly. Just a car that shouldn't have been built, racing in a category it couldn't compete in, before being excluded by rules that nobody protested. Perhaps unsurprisingly, prices for the two surviving AMR1 chassis are actually quite high. Collectors apparently value spectacular failures almost as much as spectacular successes. There's probably a metaphor in there somewhere about how we value effort over achievement, or maybe it's just that rare is rare, even if it's rarely terrible. Either way, the AMR1 has found in historic racing what it never had in period competition, a reason to exist. So that's the story of the AMR1, a car conceived in ambition, built in delusion, raced in futility, and banned in irrelevance. It remains the perfect example of how even legendary manufacturers can get it so wrong that they essentially regulate themselves out of existence. Eat it, Lockheed. At least the Starfighter occasionally worked as intended.